A ruined man hides in an empty restaurant, drowning in guilt and the silence of the past. A drenched girl enters with a notebook in her hands, carrying truths that no one has ever dared to reveal. What she shows could dismantle a sham and rekindle the hope he believed he had lost. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Let's continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. The March rain fell heavily over New York City, turning the downtown streets into a labyrinth of puddles and neon reflections. In the small diner on 8th Avenue, the dim lights flickered against the fogged-up windows, creating shadows that danced on the peeling walls. It was one of those places that time had forgotten, where coffee cost $2 and hope came free, with a reheated pastry. Thomas Wright sat alone in the darkest corner of the establishment, his fingers trembling around a cup of already cold coffee. At 52, he carried the weight of a life that had collapsed like a house of cards. The grey suit he wore, once a symbol of power and prestige, now hung loosely on his thin shoulders, stained and wrinkled like his dignity. 6 months earlier, Thomas was one of the most respected names in the American financial market. His firm, Wright Investments, managed over $2 billion and had offices in New York, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. Business leaders vied for a meeting with him. Financial journalists hung on his every word, and his wife, Frances, smiled proudly by his side at the most exclusive social events in the city. Today, he lived in a rented room in the East Village, sharing a bathroom with 3 other tenants, and surviving on the few dollars left in his savings account. Wright Investments had failed spectacularly, taking with it the dreams and savings of hundreds of families. The newspapers called him a fraud. Old friends crossed the street to avoid him, and Frances had left for her sister's house in Miami, taking only 1 suitcase and leaving behind 20 years of marriage. The sound of the diner door opening made Thomas look up from the bottom of his cup. A gust of cold wind swept in, along with a small, wet figure. It was a girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, with brown hair stuck to her face by the rain and simple, soaked clothes. She clutched a blue school notebook against her chest, protecting it from the dampness as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. The girl looked around, the nearly empty diner, her dark eyes scanning each table until they found Thomas. There was something in the way she watched him that made him shift uncomfortably in his chair. It wasn't childish curiosity or the fear children usually showed when seeing a strange man. It was something deeper, more mature than should exist in the eyes of someone so young. Without hesitation, she walked directly to his table, leaving wet footprints on the diner's worn floor. The owner, Mr. Bennett, a 60-year-old man with a grey mustache, watched the scene from behind the counter, having been wiping the same glasses for an hour. "Excuse me," the girl said, her voice soft but firm, laden with a seriousness that contrasted with her age. "Are you Thomas Wright?" Thomas felt his stomach clench. For the past few months, being recognized in public meant embarrassment, whispered accusations, or at best, looks of pity that hurt more than any insult. "That depends on who's asking," he replied, trying to keep his voice neutral as he studied the child's face. There was something familiar about her, though he was sure he had never seen her before. The girl was not intimidated. She pulled up a chair and sat across from him, placing the wet notebook on the table with reverential care. "My name is Sophia Martins, and I need to talk to you about my mother." The name Martins echoed in Thomas's mind like a distant bell. He knew that surname. He had seen it on reports, on client lists, but the memory refused to fully form, lost in the fog of guilt and shame that had clouded his thoughts for months. "Your mother," he began, but the word died on his lips when he saw the expression on Sophia's face. There was a mix of determination and sadness there that made his heart race. "She worked as an accountant," Sophia continued, opening the notebook with precise movements. "Helen Martins. She invested our family's entire savings in your company. She believed in you." The memory finally crystallized in Thomas's mind, bringing with it a wave of pain that almost made him double over the table. Helen Martins, a woman in her late 30s, dark hair always in a bun, small glasses, a shy but intelligent smile. She had attended several investor meetings, always asking insightful questions about the financial reports. Thomas remembered being impressed by her dedication and technical knowledge. "Helen," he murmured, the name coming out like a prayer or a confession. "I remember her. A very intelligent woman, very careful with numbers." Sophia nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "She always said you were different from the other businessmen, that you really cared about the people who trusted you. That's why she invested everything. The inheritance my grandfather left, the settlement from my father's work accident, all the savings she scraped together working double shifts." Each of Sophia's words was like a dagger in Thomas's heart. He knew this story. He had heard versions of it hundreds of times in recent months. Families destroyed, dreams shattered, lives ruined by his company's failure. But hearing it directly from the lips of a child, seeing the raw, naked pain in the eyes of someone so young, was a different kind of torture. "Sophia," he said, his voice thick, "I know there are no words that can... I know nothing I say will..." "She didn't blame you for what happened," Sophia interrupted, flipping through the pages of the notebook. "Mom always said you were a victim of something too, that someone had done something terrible and put the blame on you." Thomas stopped breathing. For months he had wondered if his perception was right, if there had really been something strange in the financial data in the days leading up to the collapse. But every expert, every auditor, every lawyer who analyzed the books had reached the same conclusion. Thomas Wright had made grave management errors that led his company to ruin. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, leaning forward. Sophia turned several pages of the notebook, revealing rows of numbers handwritten in small, precise script. They were complex calculations, financial equations, charts drawn with a ruler. The work was too detailed, too sophisticated for a child. "My mum was very good with numbers," Sophia explained, noticing the surprised look on Thomas's face. "She taught me math since I was little. When she started to suspect something was wrong with the investments, she brought her work home. We would stay up late. She'd explain every calculation, every discrepancy she found." Thomas looked closer at the numbers in the notebook. Even with his vision blurred by emotion and exhaustion, he could recognize some of the equations. They were risk analyses, market, projections, volatility calculations, the kind of work only someone with a deep understanding of the financial market could do. "She discovered that your company's risk algorithms were being manipulated," Sophia said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "Someone was altering the input data to make the system calculate lower risks than actually existed. That's why the investments seemed safe when they weren't." The world around Thomas seemed to slow down. The sound of the rain against the windows, the low hum of the television in the corner of the diner, even the sound of his own breathing seemed distant and muffled. For months he had tried to understand how his calculations could have been so wrong, how he had failed so completely to predict the risks that destroyed his company. "That's impossible," he murmured. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew it wasn't. Wright Investment's risk analysis system was sophisticated but not inviolable. Someone with internal access and technical knowledge could, theoretically, alter the parameters without leaving obvious traces. "Mom tried to tell someone," Sophia continued, turning more pages of the notebook. "She went to the auditors, tried to talk to other investors, she even called. Your partner, Mr. Blackwood." Victor Blackwood. The name hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. His best friend since college, the best man at his wedding, his business partner of 20 years. Victor had been the only person who had stood by him during the bankruptcy, offering moral support and even financial help, that Thomas, in his wounded pride, had refused. "What did Victor tell her?" Thomas asked, though a part of him already knew he didn't want to hear the answer. Sophia closed the notebook and looked directly into his eyes. He told her she was imagining things, that the stress of the investments was making her see problems where there weren't any. He suggested she seek medical help. The room began to spin slowly around Thomas. 20 years of partnership, 20 years of absolute trust, 20 years of friendship. Victor knew all the company's systems, had access to all the passwords, was part of every important decision. If anyone could manipulate the algorithms without a trace, it would be him. "But Mum didn't give up," Sophia said, her voice growing stronger. "She kept investigating, collecting evidence. She said she was going to prove you were being used as a scapegoat." "And where is that evidence now?" Thomas asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions overwhelming him. Sophia looked down at her small hands, clasped over the notebook. "Mom passed away 3 weeks after she discovered the truth. The doctor said it was her heart, that she couldn't handle the stress. But I know it was the weight of carrying such a big secret." The gentle euphemism didn't fool Thomas. He understood what Sophia was trying to say, without using words a child shouldn't have to know. Helen Martins had left this world, carrying the truth about the manipulation that had destroyed so many lives, including his own. "The evidence is with me now," Sophia continued, tapping the notebook lightly. "Mom taught me where to look, how to interpret the numbers. She said that if I ever found you, I should show you all of this." Thomas felt tears burn his eyes for the first time in months. They weren't tears of self-pity or despair, but something different, something he thought was dead inside him. Hope. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Why didn't you go to the police or the press or—" "Because Mom believed in you," Sophia answered simply. "She said you were a good man who had been deceived. And because—" She hesitated, biting her lower lip. "And because now, we only have each other to find the truth." The depth of loneliness in the girl's voice struck Thomas like lightning. Here was an 8-year-old child, an orphan, carrying a burden that many adults couldn't bear. And she had come to him, a broken and disgraced man, because she believed that together they could find justice. "Sophia," he said, hesitantly reaching out to touch her hand on your notebook. "Are you sure you want to do this? If your mother was right, if there really was a manipulation, it means we're dealing with dangerous people." The girl didn't pull back. Instead, she squeezed his hand with a surprising strength for someone so small. "Mum always said the truth is worth any price, and I promised her I would do the right thing." Thomas looked around the humble diner, at the peeling walls, at the rain that continued to beat against the windows. 6 months ago, he was commanding meetings in luxurious boardrooms, making decisions that moved millions of dollars, respected and admired. Now he was sitting in a greasy spoon on 8th Avenue with an orphan child who might be his only chance at redemption. "All right," he said finally, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. "Let's find the truth. Together." Sophia smiled for the first time since she had entered the diner, and in that smile, Thomas saw a reflection of the same intelligent spark he remembered in Helen Martin's eyes. Maybe it was madness to believe a child. Maybe it was desperation. But for the first time in months he felt he had a purpose. Outside, the rain began to subside, and the first rays of the afternoon sun filtered through the clouds, illuminating the table where a shattered man and a brave girl sealed an alliance that would change their lives forever. The apartment Thomas shared in the East Village was a cruel reflection of what his life had become. The tiny room barely held a single bed and a small particle-board desk. On the wall, a few damp stains drew maps of non-existent countries, and the smell of mildew competed with the aroma of reheated coffee he prepared in a makeshift corner, with a single-burner electric stove. It was there, in that cramped and melancholic space, that Sophia had insisted they go after leaving the diner. The girl had argued with the relentless logic of someone much older than her 8 apparent years. They needed a private place to properly examine her mother's findings, and the house where she now lived, with a distant aunt in Queens, didn't offer the necessary quiet. Sophia sat on the floor, her legs crossed, spreading the contents of a pink school backpack that looked like it had seen better days. Besides the blue notebook she had shown at the diner, 2 other notebooks emerged, along with several loose sheets covered in notes, some photographs of documents, and even a pink flash drive with unicorn stickers. "Mom always said the details are important," Sophia said, meticulously organizing the papers around her. "She taught me that in math, and especially in financial math, one wrong number can change everything." Thomas watched from the edge of the bed, still trying to process the surreal reality of having a child in his cramped room, discussing financial conspiracy with the casualness of someone talking about the weather. The March afternoon light streamed through the small window, creating a square of golden light on the floor where Sophia worked like an archaeologist, unearthing lost secrets. "Let's start with the basics," she said, opening the first notebook and showing a page full of hand-drawn charts. "Do you remember the risk analysis algorithm you used at the company, Sarah?" Sarah. System for Advanced Risk Analysis. Thomas had personally participated in the development of that program, working with a team of mathematicians and programmers to create what they believed was the most sophisticated tool on the American market for predicting fluctuations and calculating risk exposure. "Of course, I remember," he replied, getting off the bed to sit on the floor next to Sophia. "We took 3 years to develop it. It was the heart of our operation." "And who had full access to the system? Who could change the fundamental parameters without leaving traces in the audit logs?" Sophia's question was too direct and technical for a child. Thomas looked at her with renewed astonishment, remembering that Helen Martins had been one of the most brilliant accountants he had ever known. Apparently, she had passed on much more than mathematical knowledge to her daughter. "Technically, only Victor, and I had full administrator access," Thomas admitted. "And the lead programmer, Charles Henderson, but he left the company 2 years before the collapse." Sophia nodded and turned a few pages, revealing a complex table full of numbers and dates. Mum managed to get access to the system backups through the IT department. She knew Marcia Sanders, who worked there, and got her to provide some information. Marcia Sanders. Thomas remembered her too. A competent woman in her 40s, always willing to help with technical requests. She had been laid off along with dozens of other employees when the company went bankrupt. "Look at these numbers," Sophia said, pointing to a sequence of data in the table. "These are Sarah's original settings for analyzing commodity market volatility, and these," she turned the page, "are the settings that were active in the system during the 3 months before the collapse." Thomas leaned in to examine the numbers more closely. Even with his mind still processing the magnitude of what Sophia was suggesting, he could see the discrepancies. The risk parameters had been significantly lowered, making highly volatile investments appear safe to the algorithm. "That's impossible," he murmured, but his voice lacked conviction. "Any change to the fundamental parameters would generate automatic alerts. I would have received immediate notification." Sophia turned a few more pages and showed a series of screenshots printed on plain paper. "Mum found out the alerts were being rerouted. Instead of going to your email, they were being sent to a secondary account that Mr. Blackwood had set up to supposedly back up the system notifications." The blood in Thomas's veins seemed to turn to ice. He vaguely remembered Victor mentioning something about creating redundancy in the notification systems, a security measure in case there were problems with the main servers. At the time, it had seemed like a sensible idea, another demonstration of his partner's concern for operational efficiency. "Victor said it was for our protection," Thomas said, more to himself than to Sophia. "In case there was a technical problem, he would get the notifications and could let me know immediately." "But he never told you about the changes in the parameters, did he?" Sophia asked, her voice gentle but relentless. Thomas shook his head slowly. During the months before the bankruptcy, he had been focused on expanding the company to other states, traveling frequently, and leaving Victor in charge of supervising daily operations. He had trusted him completely, never doubting his intentions or competence. "There's more," Sophia said, taking the flash drive and plugging it into the old laptop Thomas used for his few online activities. Mom managed to download some of the system logs before they were deleted. The laptop screen displayed a series of files with coded names. Sophia clicked on one, revealing lines and lines of code that meant little to Thomas, but seemed familiar to the girl. "These are the records of the modifications made to Sarah during the last 6 months of the company's operation," she explained, scrolling through the code with the mouse. "Look here, on this date." She pointed to a specific line. "August 16th of last year. Someone modified the risk analysis algorithms for the real estate sector." Thomas remembered that date. It had been the day they approved the company's largest ever investment in real estate funds, a deal that Victor had enthusiastically championed. At the time, all analyses indicated it was a golden opportunity, with minimal risks and exceptional potential returns. 3 weeks later, Sophia continued, there was a similar modification to the algorithms for analyzing government bonds, and then in the parameters for evaluating tech company stocks. Each modification corresponded to an investment decision Thomas remembered making based on Sarah's recommendations. On every occasion, Victor had been the first to suggest the opportunity, always with convincing data and analyses that seemed solid. The pattern is clear, Sophia said, closing the file and opening another. The modifications always happened a few days before major investments. The system was altered to show lower risks than actually existed. You invested heavily based on these false analyses, and then the market behaved according to the real risks, causing massive losses. Thomas felt nauseous. The magnitude of the betrayal, if Sophia was right, went far beyond the financial issue. Victor hadn't just stolen money or manipulated data. He had systematically destroyed Thomas's reputation, the lives of hundreds of investors, and indirectly caused suffering for entire families, including Helen and Sophia Martins. "But why?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Why would Victor do this? We were partners. He lost money in the bankruptcy, too." Sophia closed the laptop and turned to look at him directly. There was a sad wisdom in her dark eyes that made Thomas's heart ache. "Mom found that out too," she said, picking up the last notebook. 2 weeks before the company went bankrupt, Mr. Blackwood transferred all of his personal assets to offshore accounts. He also made contracts to short-sell some stocks that he knew would plummet. Sophia's words echoed in the small room like gunshots. Victor had protected himself financially while orchestrating the company's destruction. More than that, he had likely profited from the collapse, selling stocks before the fall and buying others knowing exactly when the market would react to right investments' losses. "He planned it all," Thomas murmured, the reality finally sinking in. "From the beginning, he planned to use me as a scapegoat." "Mom believed so," Sophia confirmed. "She found evidence that Mr. Blackwood was working with some international investors. They wanted to bankrupt some American companies to buy up the assets at low prices after the collapse." The conspiracy was broader and more sinister than Thomas had imagined. It wasn't just about a greedy partner, but a coordinated operation to manipulate the American financial market. And he had been the perfect tool, respected, trustworthy, completely oblivious to what was happening around him. "Why are you telling me all this?" he asked again. But this time the question had a different meaning. It was no longer about motivation. It was about hope. Sophia put the notebooks back in her backpack with care, as if they were precious relics. "Because Mom made me promise 2 things before she passed," she said. "First, that I would always tell the truth no matter how much it hurt. Second, that if I had the chance to help someone who was wronged, I should do it." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the busy street of the East Village. Even from behind, Thomas could feel the weight of responsibility the girl carried. "Besides," she continued without turning around, "Mom always said that good people deserve a second chance. You lost everything because of someone else's lies. That's not fair." Thomas stood up and joined her at the window. Down below, life continued at its normal pace. People hurried along the sidewalks, cars honked in traffic, street vendors offered their goods. A world where most people believed Thomas Wright was a failed and possibly fraudulent businessman. "Sophia," he said, placing a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder, "if we try to expose the truth, it won't be easy. Victor is a powerful man. He has resources, connections, lawyers. And he gestured to the modest room around them. "We have very little." Sophia turned to look at him, and again Thomas was struck by the maturity in her eyes. "Mom always said the truth doesn't need resources to be true. It just needs the right people to tell it." They stood in silence for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts. The afternoon sun was setting, painting the New York sky with shades of orange and pink that reflected off the windows of the neighboring buildings. "All right," Thomas said finally, "let's do this. Let's expose the truth about Victor Blackwood." Sophia smiled, and for the first time since she had entered his life a few hours earlier, Thomas saw something in her beyond premature seriousness. He saw hope, determination, and a spark of that childish joy that should be natural for someone her age. "But we'll need help," he continued. We can't do this alone. Mom thought of that too, Sophia said, pulling a folded piece of paper from her jacket pocket. She made a list of people we can trust, people who were also hurt by what happened, but who still have the resources and knowledge to help us. Thomas unfolded the paper and read the names written in Helen's careful handwriting. He recognized several of them, former company employees, investors who had lost money, even a few journalists who had covered the financial scandal. At the top of the list, underlined twice, was a name that made his heart race. Daniel Martins. Daniel is my uncle, Sophia explained, noticing the recognition on Thomas's face. Mom's brother. He used to work as a financial auditor before starting his own consulting firm. Mom said that if I ever needed help with this information, he would be the first person to call. Daniel Martins. Thomas remembered him vaguely from Helen's family gatherings, a serious man in his 40s, always well-dressed, with that air of quiet competence that characterized good auditors. If Helen had trusted him to take care of Sophia if something happened, he must be someone trustworthy. Do you think he'll help us? Thomas asked. Sophia folded the paper and put it back in her pocket. Mom said he was very sad when the company went bankrupt, not because he lost money, but because he saw so many families suffer. She thought he would want to see the guilty parties punished. Thomas looked out the window once more at the city that had been his home for his entire adult life. Somewhere out there, Victor Blackwood was probably having dinner at an expensive restaurant, perhaps celebrating another day he had escaped the consequences of his actions. But that was about to change. Then let's start with your uncle, he said, feeling an energy he hadn't experienced in months coursing through his veins. And then, we'll show the world who really destroyed right investments. Sophia nodded and began to pack her things into the pink backpack. As she organized the notebooks and papers that held the evidence of Victor's betrayal, Thomas felt something he had forgotten how to feel: purpose. For the first time in 6 months, he had something to fight for. More than that, he had someone by his side, someone who believed in him when the rest of the world had turned its back. An 8-year-old girl who carried her mother's wisdom and the determination to seek justice in a world that often rewarded the dishonest. The day was ending, but for Thomas and Sophia it was just the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. Daniel Martin's office occupied the 10th floor of a commercial building in Midtown Manhattan, with large windows offering a panoramic view of New York's financial center. It was a modern and functional space, with light wood furniture and several computer screens displaying charts and spreadsheets that pulsed with the frantic life of the American financial market. Thomas felt a familiar knot in his stomach as he entered that environment. A year ago, he moved naturally through places like this, greeting colleagues, discussing deals, being treated with respect and even reverence. Now, wearing the same wrinkled suit as always, he felt like an intruder in a world that no longer belonged to him. Daniel Martins was a man of medium height, with brown hair showing some grey at the temples and attentive eyes behind discreetly framed glasses. When Sophia ran to hug him, Thomas could see the family resemblance in the shape of his face and his intelligent expression. It was easy to imagine that Helen had similar features. "Sophia, my dear," Daniel said, crouching down to be at his niece's height. "How are you? It's been a week since we've seen each other." "Uncle Dan, I need to talk to you about the things Mum discovered," Sophia said, getting straight to the point with the frankness Thomas had already learned to expect from her. "And Mr. Wright is helping me." Daniel stood up slowly and extended his hand to Thomas. There was caution in his eyes, but also a professional curiosity that was very reminiscent of Helen's. "Mr. Wright," he said in a neutral tone that revealed neither hostility nor welcome. "Sophia called me yesterday saying you two had met and had something important to show me. I must confess I was intrigued." "Mr. Martins," Thomas replied, shaking the offered hand. "I know my presence here might seem strange. I also know you have no reason to trust me. But your niece has discovered things that could change everything we know about what happened to my company." Daniel gestured for them to sit at a conference table near the windows. The March afternoon was clear, and the city stretched out below them like a 3-dimensional map of concrete and glass. Sophia immediately began to organize her materials on the table, spreading out the notebooks and papers with the precision of someone who had done this many times. "Helen called me 2 weeks before she passed," Daniel said, watching his niece work. "She was very agitated, talking about irregularities she had discovered at Wright Investments. I tried to convince her to go to the proper authorities, but she insisted she needed more evidence." Thomas felt a pang of pain. Helen had tried to warn about the fraud, but no one had taken her concerns seriously. If he himself had paid more attention to the signs, perhaps everything would be different. "Mum knew people wouldn't believe her without very solid proof," Sophia said, opening the first notebook. "That's why she kept investigating on her own." For the next hour, Sophia and Thomas presented Helen's findings to Daniel. The auditor listened in silence, making occasional notes and asking for clarification on technical points. His experience was evident in the way he questioned specific details and identified gaps in the evidence that would need to be filled. "This is impressive," Daniel said finally, leaning back in his chair. "If this information is correct, we're talking about a large-scale market manipulation operation. It's not just about one company's bankruptcy, but a scheme to destabilize the American financial sector." "What can we do?" Thomas asked. "How can we prove this in a way that the authorities will take seriously?" Daniel drummed his fingers on the table, thoughtful. "We need 3 things," he said. "First, indisputable technical evidence of the system manipulation. Second, documentation of the suspicious financial transfers. Third, witnesses who can corroborate the story." "And how do we get that?" Sophia asked. "To start, we need to access the complete backups of the SARA system," Daniel replied. "The fragments Helen managed to get are compelling, but not enough for a solid legal case." Thomas shook his head. "The company's servers were confiscated by the FBI right after the bankruptcy. They're all in an evidence storage facility." "Not necessarily," Daniel said with a half smile. "Helen mentioned you did external backups to a digital security company. TechSafe, if I'm not mistaken." TechSafe. Thomas had completely forgotten about that contract. It was a company specializing in data backup and recovery that they had hired 3 years earlier, at Victor's insistence. At the time, it had seemed like a sensible precaution against system failures or natural disasters. "Victor always said it was important to have data redundancy," Thomas murmured. "But if the backups are still there—" "They should be," Daniel said. "Contracts like that usually include data retention clauses for several years, even after the main contract ends." Sophia clapped her hands, the first genuinely childish gesture Thomas had seen her make. "That means we can prove everything Mum discovered." "It won't be that simple," Daniel warned. "To access that data, we'll need a legal warrant. And considering Victor Blackwood still has considerable influence in the financial market, getting that warrant could be complicated." As if fate wanted to underscore Daniel's words, the phone on his desk began to ring. He looked at the number on the display and frowned. "That's strange," he said. "It's from the law firm representing the interests of the former Wright Investments in the bankruptcy proceedings." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "Do they know we're investigating?" "Impossible," Daniel said, but his voice lacked conviction. He answered the phone cautiously. "Daniel Martins." The ensuing conversation was brief and one-sided. Daniel listened, asked a few short questions, and jotted down information on a piece of paper. When he hung up, his expression was grim. "I've just been officially notified that any investigation related to the assets of Wright Investments must be immediately reported to the law firm handling the bankruptcy case," he said. "Apparently, there are concerns about attempts to damage the reputation of individuals involved in the case." Sophia looked from Daniel to Thomas, confused. "What does that mean?" "It means someone knows we're investigating," Thomas replied, feeling the familiar sense of paranoia he had learned to recognize during the worst moments of his downfall. "And that person has the legal resources to try and stop us." "Victor," Sophia said, the name coming out like a bitter word. Daniel nodded slowly. "It's the only logical explanation. He must have contacts monitoring any activity related to the old company. When you called me yesterday, Sophia, and mentioned the company's name, it probably triggered some kind of alert." Thomas stood up and began pacing the room, his mind racing. For months, he had felt like a helpless victim of circumstance. Now, for the first time, he was on the other side, posing a threat to someone. It was a simultaneously thrilling and terrifying feeling. "So what do we do?" he asked. "Do we give up?" "Absolutely not," Daniel said, his voice gaining a determination that was very much like his sister's. "But we need to be more careful, and we need to act quickly before they can get a court order to stop our investigation." He stood up and walked to a cabinet in the corner of the room, from which he pulled out a laptop and some devices Thomas didn't recognize. "I have some contacts at TechSafe," Daniel said. "People who can help us access the backups without going through official channels. It's not entirely legal, but considering what we're up against, it might be our only option." Sophia quickly packed up her materials. "When can we do it?" "Tonight," Daniel replied. "TechSafe has a data center in New Jersey. My contact there can give us access after hours, when there are fewer people around." Thomas felt a mix of hope and apprehension. They were about to cross a line from which there was no turning back. Once they recovered the evidence from the backups, they would be committed to a course of action that would inevitably put them in direct conflict with Victor Blackwood. "There's one thing I need to say," he said, looking at Sophia. "If we do this, if we really go after this evidence, there's no going back. Victor will know we're a real threat, and he'll do everything he can to stop us. It could get dangerous." Sophia looked at him with that serious expression that seemed much older than her 8 years. "Uncle Dan," she said, "tell Mr. Wright what Mom always used to say about doing the right thing." Daniel smiled sadly. "Helen used to say that the right thing is rarely the easy thing, but if we don't do the right thing when we have the chance, we lose the right to complain when wrong things happen." The words echoed in the room like a reverberation of Helen Martin's wisdom, a woman who had risked everything to expose the truth and who had passed that same courage on to her daughter. "Then it's settled," Thomas said. "We're going for that evidence." The rest of the afternoon was spent planning. Daniel used his contacts to arrange access to TechSafe, while Sophia helped identify exactly which files they would need to look for in the backups. Thomas contributed his knowledge of the company's systems and passwords that might still be active. As the sun began to set over New York, the three of them left Daniel's office and headed for New Jersey. TechSafe was located in an industrial district, surrounded by warehouses and factories that at night became dark silhouettes against the orange sky. Daniel's contact was a young technician named Robert, who met them at a side entrance of the building. He seemed nervous, but determined to help. "Your sister was a good person," he said to Daniel, as he led them through corridors filled with silently humming servers. "When she came here to check the backups, she always treated everyone with respect, not like most executives." They arrived at a room full of equipment where Robert located the servers containing the data from Wright Investments. With nimble fingers, he began to navigate the files, searching for the SARA system backups from the months before the bankruptcy. "Here it is," he said after a few minutes. "All the system data, including modification logs, original configurations, and even internal emails related to the algorithm's development." Sophia watched the screens with fascination as gigabytes of data were copied to portable storage devices. It was as if they were unearthing a digital time capsule, preserving evidence of a betrayal that had destroyed so many lives. "There's something strange here," Robert said suddenly, frowning as he looked at one of the screens. "These files were accessed recently. Someone was here just 2 weeks ago downloading the same data." Daniel and Thomas exchanged worried glances. "Who?" Daniel asked. "The access was authorized by Victor Blackwood," Robert read from the screen. "He presented legal documentation claiming he needed the data for the bankruptcy proceedings." Thomas's blood ran cold. Victor not only knew they were investigating, but he had gotten to the evidence first. He was trying to destroy or alter anything that could incriminate him. "Can we see what he accessed?" Sophia asked. Robert typed commands quickly. "Yes, here's the log. He downloaded all the files related to the SARA system, including the original configurations and the modification records." "But that means he has the evidence of his own fraud," Thomas said, confused. "No," Daniel said slowly, understanding the situation. It means he's preparing to forge evidence. If he has access to the original files, he can create altered versions that exonerate him and incriminate you even further. The magnitude of what they were facing finally became clear to Thomas. They weren't just fighting to prove his innocence, but racing against time to stop Victor from creating false evidence that would make it impossible to expose the truth. "We need to act fast," Sophia said, with a determination that reminded all the adults in the room that, despite her age, she carried her mother's strength. Robert finished the copies and handed the storage devices to Daniel. "Take this and make good use of it," he said. "If Helen was right about what happened, you have in your hands the proof of the biggest financial fraud in recent years." When they left TechSafe, New York was plunged into the darkness of night. The city lights stretched to the horizon like terrestrial stars, each one representing lives that continued their routines, oblivious to the drama unfolding among them. In Daniel's car, heading back to the city center, Sophia broke the silence that had settled since they discovered Victor had accessed the same files. "Mom always said that when someone tries very hard to hide something, it's because that thing is important," she said. "If Mr. Blackwood is working so hard to cover up the truth, it's because the truth can destroy him." Thomas looked at the girl in the rearview mirror. Even in the darkness of the car, he could see the determination in her eyes. Helen Martins had raised an extraordinary daughter, someone who would not be intimidated even when faced with the impossible task of confronting one of the most powerful men in the American financial sector. "You're right," he said. "And tomorrow, we're going to show the world exactly who Victor Blackwood is." But as they drove through the streets of New York, none of them knew that Victor was already 2 steps ahead, preparing a move that would test not only their determination, but the very survival of their unlikely alliance. The mirrored building of Blackwood Capital rose imposingly on Park Avenue, its 30 floors reflecting the gray morning sky of Manhattan. Thomas watched the structure through the window of Daniel's car, feeling a mixture of anger and determination he hadn't experienced in months. In his hands, he held a manila envelope containing the evidence they had collected the night before, irrefutable proof of the betrayal that had destroyed his life. Sophia sat beside him, wearing a navy blue dress that Daniel had bought for her the previous morning. It was a simple but elegant outfit that made her look older and more serious. In the last 2 days, the girl had transformed from a lost child into a determined young woman with a clear mission. "Are you sure you want to do it this way?" Daniel asked for the 3rd time. "We could take the evidence directly to the FBI or the Securities and Exchange Commission." Thomas shook his head. "Victor has connections in all those places. He's already proven he can manipulate official processes. Our only chance is to force him to confess publicly in front of witnesses he can't silence." The strategy they had developed was risky, but it was the only one that offered a real chance of exposing the truth. That morning, Victor Blackwood was holding a press conference to announce the creation of a new investment fund, taking the opportunity to once again comment on the irresponsibility that had led to the bankruptcy of Wright Investments. The country's most important financial press would be present, along with potential investors and regulatory officials. "Mom always said that sometimes you have to confront the monster in its own lair," Sophia said, adjusting the ribbon in her hair. "It's the only way to make sure it can't run away." They got out of the car and walked towards the building. Thomas had swapped his wrinkled suit for one borrowed from Daniel, which was slightly too big for him but at least clean and pressed. He needed to look respectable when he entered the press room, at least long enough to say what he needed to say. The entrance to the Blackwood Capitol building was a vast and luxurious space, with Italian marble floors and contemporary art on the walls. Several security guards patrolled the lobby, and a blonde receptionist smiled professionally as they approached. "Good morning," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice calm. "We're accredited journalists for Mr. Blackwood's press conference." The woman checked a list on her computer and frowned. "I don't see your names here. Do you have press credentials?" Daniel stepped forward, showing an ID card he had prepared during the night. "We're from Financial Analysis magazine," he said, using the name of a small, specialized publication that actually existed. "We sent our accreditation request by email yesterday." The receptionist hesitated for a moment, then checked her email and found the message Daniel had sent a few hours earlier. Ah, yes, here it is. The elevator to the event hall is the third on the right. As they ascended to the 25th floor, Sophia squeezed Thomas's hand tightly. "Are you nervous?" she asked. "Very," he admitted. "And you?" "Me too. But Mom always said that courage isn't not being afraid. It's doing the right thing, even when you are afraid." The elevator doors opened to reveal an elegant corridor leading to the event hall. There was already a bustle of journalists, camera operators and others involved in producing the press conference. Thomas recognized several faces from the financial press, people who a year ago treated him with respect and who would now likely see him as a pathetic figure trying to redeem himself. The hall itself was impressive, with large windows offering a panoramic view of New York and a small stage where Victor Blackwood would soon make his statements. There were about 50 people present, including journalists, investors, and what appeared to be regulatory officials. Thomas spotted Victor on the other side of the room, talking animatedly with a group of businessmen. At 55, Victor maintained the look of success he had always cultivated: perfectly cut grey hair, an impeccable Italian suit, a confident smile that radiated competence and trust. It was hard to believe that this man, who had been his best friend for 2 decades, was responsible for so much destruction. "There he is," Sophia murmured, following Thomas's gaze. "Remember the plan," Daniel said discreetly. We wait for him to start his remarks, and then Thomas speaks up during the question and answer session. "Sophia, you stay with me until I give the signal." They found seats at the back of the room and waited. Gradually, the murmur of conversations died down as people settled into their chairs. Victor ascended the small stage, accompanied by 2 aides, greeted the audience with his characteristic smile, and positioned himself behind the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice easily filling the hall, "it is with great pleasure that I announce today the creation of Blackwood Global Investment, a new fund that represents the future of American investments in the international market." Thomas felt a wave of nausea as he heard the words flow so easily from Victor's lips. Here was the man who had destroyed his company, ruined hundreds of families, and indirectly caused the premature death of Helen Martins, talking about the future of investments as if he were a visionary instead of a criminal. "In recent years," Victor continued, "we have witnessed tragic cases of irresponsibility in the American financial sector. Companies like the former Wright Investments have shown that a lack of proper controls and reckless management can lead to devastating consequences for innocent investors." It was at that moment that something inside Thomas broke. Hearing Victor use the destruction he himself had, caused as an example of irresponsibility, was more than he could bear. He stood up abruptly from his chair, the movement causing a ripple of curiosity through the room. "Mr. Blackwood," Thomas said, his voice carrying further across the hall than he expected, "could you comment on the systematic manipulations of the SARA system that caused the bankruptcy of Wright Investments?" The silence that followed was absolute. Television cameras turned towards Thomas, photographers' flashes began to pop, and a murmur of recognition spread through the audience as people realized who was speaking. Victor's smile faltered for a fraction of a second but quickly recomposed itself. "Thomas," he said, feigning surprise and perhaps even pleasure at seeing him, "how unexpected. I didn't know you were here." "Answer the question," Thomas insisted, walking towards the stage. "Can you explain how you managed to alter the risk parameters of the SARA system without leaving traces in the main audit logs?" Victor laughed, a forced sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Thomas, I understand you're still trying to find scapegoats for your own mistakes, but making baseless accusations in public isn't going to help anyone." "Baseless?" Thomas pulled the manila envelope from inside his jacket and waved it in the air. "I have here the complete backups of the SARA system, including logs that show exactly when and how you manipulated the risk analysis algorithms." A buzz of excitement ran through the room. Journalists began to take notes furiously, cameras focused on the envelope in his hands, and Thomas could see expressions of genuine interest on the faces of those present. Victor stepped down from the stage and walked towards Thomas, maintaining his smile, but with hard eyes. "You're making a fool of yourself," he said in a low voice for Thomas's ears only. "There's no evidence because I never did anything wrong." "Then you wouldn't mind explaining these bank transfers to offshore accounts 2 weeks before the company's bankruptcy?" Sophia had joined them, carrying one of her mother's notebooks. The girl's appearance caused a new murmur in the audience. Victor looked at her with an expression that mixed surprise and something that could have been fear. "And who are you, little girl?" he asked, trying to maintain a condescending tone. "My name is Sophia Martins," she replied, her voice clear and strong despite her age. "My mother, Helen Martins, discovered your fraud before. She passed away. She documented everything." The name Helen Martins had a visible effect on Victor. For the first time since Thomas had begun to confront him, his mask of confidence slipped completely. "Helen Martins was paranoid," he said, but his voice trembled slightly. "She saw conspiracies where there were none." "So you do remember her," Sophia said, opening the notebook. "Do you remember when she called you, worried about the discrepancies in the calculations, and how you told her she was imagining things?" Sophia began to read aloud from her mother's notes, detailing every conversation Helen had had with Victor, every frustrated attempt to warn about the irregularities. The audience listened in absolute silence, capturing every word. Daniel appeared beside them, carrying a laptop. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press," he said, "if you'll allow me, I'd like to show you concrete evidence of the allegations being made." He connected the laptop to a projector and began displaying data from the backups they had recovered the previous night. Charts clearly showed how the SARA system parameters had been altered. Tables detailed Victor's suspicious financial transfers, and internal emails revealed a careful coordination to manipulate the risk analyses. This is a fabrication," Victor shouted, completely losing his composure. "This data has been altered. Thomas is trying to frame me to escape his own responsibilities." "So you deny creating the secondary email account that received the system change alerts?" asked a journalist from the front row. "Do you deny short-selling stocks of companies you knew would be affected by the losses of right investments?" asked another. "Do you deny manipulating the risk algorithms on at least 12 occasions in the 6 months prior to the bankruptcy?" Sophia read directly from her mother's notes. The questions came from all sides. Now a barrage of accusations based on the evidence being presented. Victor looked around the room like a cornered animal, searching for an escape that didn't exist. "You don't understand," he said finally, his voice desperate. "The American market was too unstable. Someone had to make tough decisions to protect the real investments. Thomas was too emotional, too attached to old methods." "So you admit you manipulated the system?" asked a television reporter. Victor realized too late that he had fallen into the trap. In his desperation to justify himself, he had confessed to exactly what they were accusing him of. I protected the interests of the most important investors," he stammered. "Thomas would have ruined everything with his incompetent management." "Protected at the cost of hundreds of families who lost their savings," Sophia said, her voice filled with a deep sadness. "Protected at the cost of my mother's life." The silence that followed was absolute. In Victor's last statements, everyone present had heard a full confession. He had admitted to the manipulation, the sabotage, and the use of inside information to profit from the destruction of his own partner's company. Thomas felt his legs give way beneath him. For months he had carried the weight of guilt, believing his incompetence had destroyed the lives of so many people. Now, in front of dozens of witnesses and television cameras, the truth had finally been revealed. "Mr. Blackwood," Daniel said, closing the laptop, "I suggest you find a lawyer. This evidence has already been sent to the FBI, the SEC, and the District Attorney's Office." Victor looked around the room one last time, saw the faces of the journalists who were already typing furiously on their phones, and then simply walked out, followed by the contemptuous gazes of people who, minutes before, had treated him with respect. In the days that followed, the story exploded in the American media. "The biggest financial fraud of the decade," screamed the headlines. "Businessman manipulates system to destroy partner," declared the news websites. "8-year-old girl exposes financial conspiracy," reported the television programs. Victor Blackwood was arrested 3 days later, charged with fraud, market manipulation, and insider trading. His assets were frozen, and investigations revealed a network of corruption that extended far beyond Wright Investments. For Thomas, the public vindication was just the beginning of a longer process of rebuilding. His name was officially cleared, criminal charges against him were dropped, and several job offers began to roll in. But the most important transformation in his life had nothing to do with money or career. 2 weeks after Victor's exposure, Thomas was sitting in a social worker's office, holding Sophia's hand as she signed the papers that would make her adoption official. The girl had lost her mother, but found a father. Thomas had lost his company, but found a daughter. "Dad," Sophia said, using the word for the first time. "Mum would be proud of us, wouldn't she?" Thomas looked at the extraordinary girl, who had walked into his life in a humble diner on 8th Avenue and changed everything. Helen Martins had raised not just an intelligent and brave daughter, but a person who deeply understood the value of truth and justice. "Yes, sweetheart," he said, hugging her. "Your mother would be very proud. Of both of us." Outside the social worker's office, New York continued its frantic pace. Cars honked in traffic, people hurried along the sidewalks. The city pulsed with the life of millions of people chasing their dreams and facing their challenges. But for Thomas and Sophia, the world had become a different place. A place where truth could triumph over lies, where a child's courage could bring down an empire of corruption, and where two lost people could find each other and build a new family based on love and honesty. 6 months later, Thomas opened his new financial consulting firm, specializing in auditing and fraud detection. Sophia, now 9, attended a good private school and still helped her father with complex calculations in the afternoons, showing a natural talent for mathematics that would have made her mother proud. Every night before bed they remembered Helen Martins and the courage she had shown in seeking the truth, even knowing the risks she faced. And every morning they woke up grateful to have found each other and for the chance to build a future where justice and honesty were not just ideals, but lived realities. The story of Thomas Wright and Sophia Martins became a symbol of hope for many people facing impossible situations. It proved that even when all seems lost, when the entire world turns against you, the truth still has the power to set you free, and that sometimes the smallest person can have the greatest courage. In the end, it wasn't wealth or power that triumphed, but the determination of a girl who refused to let her mother's memory be in vain, and the strength of a man who found redemption not just for himself, but for all who had been wronged by the greed of someone who should have been worthy of trust. 2 years later, the office of Wright Auditing and Consulting occupied an entire floor of a modern building in the financial district, with a view of the Hudson River and the distant hills surrounding New York City. It was a bright and welcoming space, with plants on the windowsills and family photographs on the desks, a far cry from the cold corporate environment Thomas had known in the past. Sophia, now 10, was sitting at a smaller desk next to the main one, helping her father review financial reports. Her brown hair had grown long and was tied in braids, and she wore small glasses that gave her an even more serious air. On the wall behind her, a framed photograph showed Helen Martins smiling, a constant presence blessing the work they did together. "Dad, there's something strange in these numbers from the construction company," Sophia said, pointing to a spreadsheet on her computer. "Their material expenses are up 40% in 3 months, but there's no proportional increase in production." Thomas came over to examine the data his daughter had identified. In 2 years of working together, he had learned to completely trust Sophia's mathematical instincts. The girl had a natural talent for detecting irregularities that often escaped even experienced auditors. "You're right," he said, analyzing the discrepancies. "It could be overbilling or material theft. We'll need to do a deeper investigation." Wright Auditing had specialized in detecting corporate fraud, helping companies and investors avoid the kinds of manipulation that had destroyed Thomas's old firm. The work was rewarding not just financially, but emotionally. Every fraud uncovered, every scheme dismantled, was a victory against people like Victor Blackwood. The office door opened and Daniel Martins walked in, carrying a briefcase full of documents and 2 cups of coffee. He had become an informal partner in the firm, providing technical expertise and helping with more complex cases. His uncle's presence had been crucial for Sophia in the first few months after the adoption, offering a bridge between her old life and her new reality. "Good morning, everyone," Daniel said, handing a coffee to Thomas and a cup of hot chocolate to Sophia. "I have news on the Blackwood case." Victor's trial had lasted over a year, with his defense trying everything to minimize the charges. But the evidence collected by Helen Martins, combined with subsequent investigations that revealed other fraudulent schemes, had been irrefutable. Victor was sentenced to 12 years in prison, in addition to paying millions in reparations to the wronged investors. "What happened?" Sophia asked, always interested in the developments of the case that had changed their lives. "His defense filed another appeal, but the court rejected it again," Daniel explained. "The sentence is confirmed. He'll serve the full term." Thomas felt a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't revenge he sought, but justice. Every day Victor spent in prison was a day that other people were protected from his schemes. The morning passed quickly with routine work, financial analyses, and report preparation. Sophia attended a private school in the morning and spent her afternoons at the office, where she had become a sort of mascot for the employees. She had her own desk, her own projects, and even business cards that read Sophia Wright, Junior Consultant. Around noon, the company's secretary announced over the intercom that Thomas had a visitor. He wasn't expecting anyone, and his schedule was clear until the afternoon. "Send them up," he said, intrigued. A few minutes later, a woman of about 40 entered the office. She was elegant, well-dressed, with short blonde hair and blue eyes that seemed to carry a deep sadness. She hesitated at the door, as if unsure she should be there. "Mr. Wright," she said, her voice soft but tense. "My name is Carla Rogers. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Thomas replied, standing up to greet her. "How can I help you?" Sophia peered over her glasses, always curious about the visitors who came to the office. Most were business owners worried about irregularities in their companies or investors who had been deceived and were seeking help. "It's about my husband," Carla said, sitting in the offered chair. "He worked as an accountant at Blackwood Capital. He lost his job when the company was investigated, and since then, well, things haven't been easy." The name Blackwood Capital made Thomas pause. It was the company Victor had created. After leaving Wright Investments, the same one where he had orchestrated his last fraudulent schemes before being arrested. "I'm very sorry for what you've been through," Thomas said sincerely. "Many innocent people were hurt by Victor Blackwood's actions." "That's what I wanted to talk to you about," Carla continued, opening a small purse and taking out an envelope. "My husband, Robert, always believed you had been wronged. When everything came out, when the truth was revealed, he felt terrible for not having realized what was happening." She handed the envelope to Thomas. "Before he passed away, Robert found some documents at the office that might be important. He didn't know what to do with them, but he always said that one day he would find a way to help the families who were harmed." Thomas opened the envelope and found several sheets of paper, all covered with handwritten notes and photocopies of financial documents. It was a detailed record of suspicious transactions that Robert had observed during his last months at Blackwood Capital. "Your husband passed away?" Sophia asked gently, using the same delicate language she had learned when they talked about her own mother. Carla nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "6 months ago. The doctor said it was his heart, but I know it was the weight of guilt. Robert was a very honest man. Finding out he had worked for someone like Victor Blackwood destroyed him inside." Daniel came over and examined the documents. "These records are very detailed," he said. "Robert was documenting operations that even the official auditors didn't uncover." Thomas studied the papers more closely. They were evidence of more fraudulent schemes, operations that had taken place even after the collapse of Wright Investments. Victor had continued to deceive people until the very last possible moment. "Mrs. Rogers," Sophia said, getting up from her desk and approaching the visitor, "may I ask if Mr. Rogers had any children?" "He did," Carla replied, smiling through her tears. "A daughter, Annabeth. She's 12 now." Sophia looked at Thomas with a meaningful expression. It was the same expression she had used 2 years ago, in the diner on 8th Avenue, when she had decided they should work together to expose the truth. "Dad," she said, "I think we need to help Mrs. Rogers and Annabeth, and I think Mr. Rogers would want us to use this information to help other families who were harmed." Thomas smiled. Sophia had developed not only her mother's mathematical talent, but also her compassion and sense of justice. The girl understood instinctively that their work was not just about detecting fraud, but about protecting innocent people. "You're right," he said. "Mrs. Rogers, these documents your husband preserved can help other victims of Victor Blackwood recover at least part of what they lost." For the next 2 hours, Carla told her family's story of how Robert had struggled with depression after discovering he had been used as an instrument in fraudulent schemes, and how she was now raising Annabeth alone with limited resources. Daniel explained how Robert's documents could be used to reopen investigations and potentially recover assets hidden by Victor. Sophia, in turn, showed Carla how the company worked and how they had turned a personal tragedy into a force for good. "You know," Carla said, preparing to leave, "Robert always said that bad things sometimes happen to teach us how to be better people. I think he would be happy to know his notes are going to help other families." After Carla left, Thomas, Sophia, and Daniel stayed in the office discussing the next steps. Robert's documents would open a new front of investigation, potentially leading to the recovery of millions of dollars for fraud victims. "Do you know what this means?" Sophia asked, organizing the papers into neat piles. "That we have a lot of work ahead of us," Thomas replied. "No," Sophia said, smiling. "It means Mom and Mr. Rogers are still helping people, even though they're not here anymore. It means their kindness lives on through what we do." Thomas looked at his extraordinary daughter, a girl who had learned to turn pain into purpose, tragedy into a mission. Helen Martins had raised someone truly special, someone who saw the world not just as a place of problems to solve, but as a place where there was always hope for those willing to fight for what is right. In the afternoon, while Sophia was at school, Thomas received an unexpected call. It was from a television producer interested in making a documentary about his and Sophia's story. The proposal was tempting: to tell their story to millions of people, to inspire others facing difficult situations. But when Sophia returned from school and he mentioned the proposal, she shook her head immediately. "Dad, our story doesn't need to be famous to be important," she said. "What matters is that we keep helping people like Mrs. Rogers. Mom always said that true heroism happens when no one is watching." Thomas agreed. They had found their purpose not in fame or public recognition, but in the quiet work of protecting others from those who would abuse their trust. That evening, as Sophia did her homework at the kitchen table of their apartment on the Upper West Side, Thomas prepared dinner and reflected on how their lives had changed. 2 years earlier, he was a broken man, living in a rented room in the East Village, believing his life was over. Now, he had a daughter he loved more than anything in the world, a thriving company that made a difference in people's lives, and a purpose that gave meaning to each day. Most importantly, he had learned that redemption didn't come from erasing the past, but from using the lessons of the past to build a better future. "Dad," Sophia said, looking up from her math homework, "can I ask you a question?" "Of course, sweetheart." "Do you think when we get old other kids will need our help like I needed yours?" Thomas smiled, moved by the wisdom of the question. "Probably." "Why?" "Because I want to be ready to help them, like you were ready to help me, and like Mom prepared me to help you." There it was, the true legacy of Helen Martins, not just an extraordinary daughter, but a lineage of kindness that would perpetuate through generations. Sophia had learned not just math and logic, but the deepest values of life: courage, compassion, and the determination to do what is right. That night, after Sophia had fallen asleep, Thomas sat on the balcony of his apartment, looking at the lights of New York City stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there, Victor Blackwood was paying for his crimes in a prison cell. Elsewhere, families like Carla's and Annabeth's were struggling to rebuild their lives after being betrayed by people they trusted. But there was also hope. There were people like Daniel, who used their skills to protect the vulnerable. There were employees like Robert, who, even facing enormous pressure, chose to document the truth. And there were children like Sophia, who carried, within them, the determination to make the world a better place. The story that had begun in a humble diner on 8th Avenue had become something much larger than one man's personal redemption or a brave girl's quest for justice. It had become proof that even in the darkest moments when all seems lost, it is still possible to find light. And that light, Thomas knew, would continue to shine through Sophia, and through all the people she would help throughout her extraordinary life. The true victory wasn't in defeating Victor Blackwood, but in ensuring that his evil would not be perpetuated, that his greed would be replaced by generosity, his dishonesty by truth. As the city slept around him, Thomas made a silent promise to Helen Martins. He would continue to honor her memory by protecting Sophia and using her talent to protect others. The lineage of kindness would continue, generation after generation, until the world became the place Helen had dreamed it could be. A place where truth defeated lies, where courage overcame fear, and where love was always stronger than hate.